Ever feel like learning has this whole hitting science to it? We're out here trying to learn new things all the time, but wouldn't it be amazing to really get how it all works?
Totally. It's like there's this art to learning effectively, and you're right, most of us never got the instruction manual.
Exactly. And lucky for us, that's kind of what this deep dive is all about, right? We're diving into theoretical foundations of learning objectives and instructional strategies. Sounds kind of intense, I know.
Yeah, the title sounds like something you'd read for a PhD. Haha.
Right. So before we start, can you promise it's okay if I haven't pulled an all-nighter studying educational theory?
Uh-huh. I promise. No PhD required. It's actually packed with useful stuff anyone can apply.
Okay, good to know. So where does this paper even begin? Does it jump right into the nitty-gritty of how we learn?
Well, first, it actually takes a step back, points out that people have been fascinated by learning for, like, ever. I mean, even ancient philosophers, guys like Socrates, they were debating the best ways to learn.
Wow, so this whole learning how to learn thing, that's not just some new fad.
Nope, not at all. But the paper does say that things shifted big time in the 20th century.
Oh.
Well, before it was all about just watching behavior. Like, oh, the students are sitting quietly, they must be learning.
I get it. But we all know that's not always true. Just because you look like you're paying attention.
Exactly. So the paper talks about this shift, understanding what's going on inside our minds, cognitivism. It's like we stopped treating the brain like a black box and started actually trying to figure out the mechanics.
Okay, so like instead of just seeing the input and output, we're trying to understand the actual processing happening in between.
Right. And one of the big aha moments in the learning process.
Learning objectives.
Learning objectives. Okay, I have to admit, that sounds a little dry, like a checklist or something.
I know. The name is not very exciting, but they're way cooler than they sound.
Okay, I'm listening. Convince me. What makes them so important? Well, they're like your internal GPS for learning. Without them, it's like you're just wandering around hoping you'll bump into some knowledge. The paper breaks them down into 3 levels, actually. Course level, learning objectives, then lesson level objectives.
So it's about connecting those big picture goals to the smaller steps that'll get you there.
You got it. Let's say you're learning to, I don't know, play the piano. Your course level objective might be to play a whole sonata, but your learning objective could be mastering a specific technique, like scales, and then a lesson level objective,
Yeah.
nailing a tricky chord progression, something like that.
Okay, that makes sense, breaking it down like that. But how do we actually make sure we're setting good learning objectives? Anyone can write a list of things they want to learn.
Good question. This is where it gets really practical, actually. The paper talks about this framework called SMART objectives.
SMART objectives. Okay, I've definitely heard that before. But hold on, before we get into the details.
Sure, go for it.
Why are they so important? Is it just about being organized? Or does it really change the way our brains learn?
It's both, actually. It's about setting yourself up for success, giving your brain a clear target. Let me ask you this. Imagine you're trying to learn a new language, and your objective is just learn to speak fluently. What would you do with that?
Well, not much, to be honest. It's so vague.
Right. Now imagine your objective is, by the end of this month, I will be able to hold a 5-minute conversation about my hobbies in target language.
Okay, that's way better. I can already picture myself ordering that croissant in Paris.
Exactly. Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, SMART.
So objectives are our roadmap. They're smart. What's next?
Next comes the engine that drives us along that roadmap, instructional strategies. And trust me, this paper does not disappoint. It gets into some really cool approaches, like inquiry-based learning, which completely changes how we learn.
Oh, inquiry-based learning. That's where you're not just given information. You get to ask questions and explore,
You
right?
got it? It's like we become knowledge detectives. And there's this cool framework called the 5 E's.
5 E's. Tell me more.
Engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. It's not just about getting the right answer. It's about understanding how you got there and then building on it.
That actually reminds me of the story from the paper about a study where students were learning about photosynthesis. That actually reminds me of this story from the paper about a study where students were learning about photosynthesis. But instead of just memorizing the steps, they designed their own experiments to see how different things affected plant growth.
Yes, that's a perfect example. And the results they got were incredible, weren't they? The students who did the hands-on stuff not only understood the concepts better, but they even remembered them for longer.
Exactly. It's totally different to actually do something, right? Like reading a recipe versus actually baking the cake.
100%.
Speaking of doing stuff, the paper also gets into this whole other approach. Cooperative learning. It's like teamwork makes the dream work, right?
Right. So inquiry-based learning can be about exploring on your own. But with cooperative learning, it's all about working together. There's this fascinating study in the paper. They put students in groups, gave them this super complex problem to solve.
Okay, so not just textbook problems, but like real world stuff.
Yeah. And get this, the groups that had been specifically taught how to work together,
Hmm.
active listening, communicating respectfully, they came up with more creative solutions and understood the material better.
Makes sense. Sometimes you just got to talk it out, bouncing ideas off each other can really get the gears turning.
Totally. And let's be real, being able to collaborate effectively, that's a skill you need everywhere, not just in school.
So true. Okay, so we've got inquiry-based learning, cooperative learning.
Yeah.
Is there anything else in this learning toolkit of ours?
Oh, there's more. Don't forget about differentiated instruction. That's where things get really personalized,
Right.
Tailoring the learning to each student's needs and what they like.
Right. The paper talked about choice boards, which sounded pretty cool. I mean, way more interesting than everyone read chapter 3 and answered these questions.
I know, right? Choice boards give students control. Let's say you're learning about, I don't know, ancient civilizations. You could have the choice to write a story, make a 3D model of a building, or even write a song from that time period.
Okay, now you're making me wish I could go back to school.
Uh-huh.
So, we've got all these amazing strategies, but there's this big old elephant in the room, isn't there?
What's that?
Technology. It's changing how we do pretty much everything, learning included.
You're telling me. And the paper talks about that, how we can use technology to our advantage. They call it blended learning. It's about finding ways to blend tech into the learning without it taking over,
Yeah, because just using a laptop doesn't automatically make something educational, does it?
Exactly. You've got to be intentional about it. Like
Yeah.
those virtual reality programs that let you experience walking on the moon or dissecting a heart.
Okay, that's way cooler than a textbook diagram.
Right. Or simulations where you can play around with complex systems. And of course, there's flipped instruction.
Flip learning. That's where you learn the material before class, right? So maybe watching a video or something instead of a lecture. And then class time is for activities and discussion.
Yeah, exactly. It's a
Yep.
totally different way to learn.
Okay, so we've got objectives, strategies. We've even acknowledged the tech elephant. How do we know if any of it's actually working? Time for a pop quiz.
Uh-huh. Not quite. But you've hit on something really important. How do we measure learning? That's where assessment comes in. And the paper breaks it down into two main types, formative and summative.
Formative assessment always sounded kind of scary to me. I don't know why.
I think it's just the name. It's actually pretty simple. It's like those little check-ins you do along the way to see if you're on track or need to adjust something.
So instead of crashing and burning at the end of the semester, you're making smaller course corrections as you go.
Exactly. Now, summative assessment, that's like your final destination on the learning journey. Big exams, projects, that kind of thing. Those are designed to see how well you've mastered everything overall.
Okay, that makes sense. But here's where I think things can get a little tricky. What if your assessments don't actually match up with your learning objectives? Then you're kind of measuring the wrong things, aren't you?
That's a great point, and the paper stresses just how important that alignment is. Like imagine you spend weeks teaching students to write a persuasive essay, but then your final exam only tests grammar.
Right. It's like you taught them how to build this whole amazing house, but you're only grading them on whether they use the right kind of hammer.
Exactly. The assessments need to line up with what you're actually trying to teach.
Okay, so much good stuff to think about. This paper has been seriously eye-opening, but I have a feeling it's not always easy to put all these ideas into practice in the real world, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it can get pretty messy out there in the real world of classrooms and lesson plans, right? Like, how do educators keep up with all the changes happening? New information, new tech. It's a lot.
It definitely keeps you on your toes. The paper actually compares it to navigating by the stars. You need that fixed point to set your course, but you also got to be ready to adjust when the wind changes.
I like that analogy because it's not about throwing the map out the window when things get unpredictable.
Right, exactly. And I think that's where having a strong understanding of the learning process, the stuff we've been talking about, that's what helps educators adapt. Because even when the what changes, the specific content you're teaching, the how, is still grounded in those core principles.
That makes sense. So speaking of changing winds, technology, it's like this constantly evolving landscape, and it can be a lot for educators to navigate. No kidding. And the paper talks about that, about finding that balance. Because technology can be an amazing tool, but it can also be a huge distraction.
Oh, tell me about it. I've totally been that person in the meeting, pretending to take notes on my laptop when I'm really just
Catching up on emails.
busted.
But in all seriousness, the paper makes this great point. It's not about using tech just because it's there. It's about being intentional. Choose tools that actually enhance the learning, not just add more noise.
So true. And sometimes the best tool for the job might actually be like an actual book, right?
Sometimes. It's about finding that sweet spot where traditional methods and new technology can work together.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of flexibility, of being intentional with technology, but there's one more piece to this puzzle, right? This idea of inclusivity that the paper keeps coming back to.
So important. And it's not just about being nice. It's about recognizing that every student brings something unique to the classroom. Their backgrounds, their experiences, how they learn best. It all matters.
It's like diversity in the classroom isn't just a box to tick, it actually makes the learning richer for everyone.
100%. It challenges educators to think outside that one-size-fits-all box. That's where differentiated instruction comes in. You know, tailoring your lessons to the individual learners in front of you.
Which goes back to that idea we talked about earlier about different learning styles and learning differences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because not every student learns at the same pace or in the same way, and that's okay. That's why understanding those differences, having those conversations, that's so crucial.
It's about making sure everyone feels supported and empowered to learn, which I love.
Wow. Okay. This whole deep dive has been incredible. Thank you so much for walking us through this paper. It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
You and me both. I mean, that's what I love about this field. It's always evolving. We keep asking new questions, finding new ways to help people learn and grow. It's exciting.
It is. So what are some of the big questions that you're thinking about these days when it comes to the future of learning, I mean? Well, for me, it keeps coming back to technology. It has so much potential, but are we using it in a way that truly transforms learning?
That's a great question. And I'm also curious about this whole connection between engagement and achievement.
Right.
Well,
If we can crack the code on that, who knows what we could accomplish.
I love that. Well, on that note, I think we've given everyone a lot to chew on for today. But before we wrap up, any final words of wisdom for all our fellow learning enthusiasts out there?
Just this. Never be afraid to keep learning. Try new things, ask questions, be curious, and most importantly, have fun along the way.
Perfectly said. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.